All right, bonjour. We're going to talk about Versailles now. This will be the second of the lectures devoted to French Baroque art. I'm going to go right to the images. And show you this full-length portrait of Louis XIV, which we looked at last. Louis is the personage who created Versailles over quite a long period of time, as you'll find out. Louis came to power in 1661, and at that time, the French monarchy had a number of properties. The main palace was in Paris, and that was the Louvre. But there were other palaces at Fontainebleau, 40 miles away. There was a palace at Saint-Germain-en-Laye. There was also a hunting lodge at Versailles that had been developed by Louis's father, Louis XIII. Louis was reluctant to remain in Paris for a number of reasons. His grandfather, Henry IV, had been assassinated there. If he was to modernize the palace at Versailles, this would create a great deal of disruption in the city, and there were no space limitations for doing that. He thus elected to move to Versailles, which is only 12 miles away, where he would be safer, where he could carry on. He could develop a big court and have essentially the whole aristocracy of France in attendance, where he could keep an eye on them. Their presence would create a greater mystique about him. He could carry on affairs apart from the prying eyes of Parisian citizens. And so this is what he elected to do, to go to Versailles. Here we're seeing the palace that was developed there over time. Now, in going here and wanting to build a grand palace to house the court, he had a major decision to make, and that was whether to simply expand the existing hunting lodge of his father, or to tear that down and to start from scratch. And there were people that urged him to do one or the other. But in the end, he elected to save the hunting lodge and then simply build around it. Well, we're looking at this view, and what this shows us is the palace at Versailles from the garden side of the palace, and we're looking toward the entrance court out here. And this shows us most clearly the great trivium of roads, the three roads that symmetrically converge on the palace, that arrange the space and the movement of people and vehicles toward the palace on the entrance side. Now, this was a planning idea that had been developed in Rome in the late 16th century under the papacy of Sixtus V. And it was an idea, but quite a powerful idea, a compelling idea that then was adopted at other places, quite emphatically here. The middle road is called the Avenue de Paris, and that does continue for quite a distance. The lateral roads, one of them ends out here, and the other continues within a bends. So this image of unyielding power and control imposed on the landscape is really rather illusory. But from the palace, from the great plaza in front of the palace, one has that sense quite strongly. And originally, these three roads converged on an equestrian statue of the king, which was located right here. So, just as we saw in Rome, obelisks located at important places, most especially right in front of St. Peter's, as a focal point, as an organizing object at the center of an expansion of space. Space converges or diverges from that focal point. In this case, there was an equestrian statue. And so the trivium takes on very clear political significance. Power is extended outward from the representation of the king on horseback across France, and it seems to yield to nothing, at least from the point of view of the equestrian statue. So that's the entrance side of the palace there. By the way, the equestrian statue was destroyed during the French Revolution, 1789 or thereabout. And then the garden side of the palace lies out here. And if we move ahead, here we can see, turned around, the trivium converging on the palace down below. And you can see the palace itself. It has a U-shaped configuration. And notice the main axis of the Avenue de Paris then extends right through the gardens, literally for miles into the distance. And we can see all kind of allées, walkways, roadways that converge on focal points. One here, one here, one over here. Now we would call this, of course, a trivium, where three roads converge. The term for this would be a polyvium, where many roads converge on a focal point. And if you think about this, it's in effect an emblem of the sun in splendor, with rays radiating outward from the sun itself. Thus, it's a kind of emblem of Louis XIV himself, who was known as the Sun King, and who adopted and then elaborated that emblem of his identity and his control. And connected to that also is the life-bringing impact of the sun on the landscape, bringing warmth to human beings, making life possible. The next image we're looking at, I'm going to try and enlarge it here, is one that shows us the gradual expansion of the palace. So what we're seeing here, at the very center in brown, is the shape of the original hunting lodge of Louis XIII. And you can see it's rather small in comparison to the palace that came about over time. Notice it's a U-shaped and it's also symmetrical. And this was quite typical of large-scale building design at that time. The people involved in the enlargement of the palace, architects Louis Laveau initially, and then when he passed away, he was replaced by Jules Hardouin-Mansart. The painter that also oversaw really the whole development of Versailles, his name was Charles Lebrun, and then the landscape architect, and we'll look at the garden design later on, was André Lenotre. Louis Laveau, the first of the architects involved here, initially added two big additions to the palace, here and here, and these were called the envelope. Well, they envelop the palace, and you notice that they leave courtyards open so as to bring light and air down into the palace. There were also these pavilions established. Notice all these things are in a kind of deep gold color. So these were some of the first additions to the palace. Then the dark yellow color, that comes later. And you can see one of the wings was built over here and over here. And then the space that had formerly been left as a recess was filled in. And that's when the Hall of Mirrors was created in this location under the direction of Jules Hardouin-Mansart. I'll point out just two more additions. Right here is the Royal Chapel, and this dates from 1690 to 1710, also designed by Jules Hardouin-Mansart. And then in the middle of the 18th century, the Opera House was built out here, and this was the design of Jean-Jacques Gabriel. So many architects involved, but the two most important ones for us are Louis Laveau and Jules Hardouin-Mansart. And we can see that the palace was really very frequently in a state of construction, modification. We have to think of this as a project that unfolded over time. It came about incrementally, not all at once. All right, here's a view then down the Avenue de Paris toward the entrance court of the palace. It's kind of a messy view. You'll notice, by the way, that the palace has no central motif that would span highest and really dominate one's impression. The, the tallest part of the palace is over here, and this is the Royal Chapel, which was added later. It's also a rather messy view because buses park here in the summer and cars on the other side. So we've got a lot of clutter of things that stand in between our point of view and the palace itself. Now, as we get closer, here we're looking at the marble court. And this is the innermost courtyard, closest to the palace. I should back up here again and show you that the palace is laid out so that space is condensed. Space diminishes gradually, step by step by step. And there were a number of grills that controlled access. So depending upon your status, depending upon your social position, your role here, you could progress closer and closer to the palace. At some point you were stopped. And eventually then, the marble court stood closest to the palace, and only members of the royal family, and perhaps the highest standing courtiers, could tread on the marble surface of the royal palace. I want to compare the architecture here to that of an Italian palazzo. Remember that we're looking at the hunting lodge of Louis XIII, modified, added to during the reign of Louis XIV. And what we're looking at here is traditional French architecture. The main difference between it and Italian architecture is the visible roof. And this is what's called a mansard roof. It's sort of part wall, part roof, and it has windows, and it really functioned partly as an upper story of the palace. Another feature of traditional French architecture is the use of brick as the primary building material, with stone used to frame doors and windows as a kind of trim element. There's also a lot of kind of fussy architectural detail, which we see along the top of the roof, projecting balcony. It gives the palace a modest central motif. There are also portrait busts of Roman emperors that were attached to the building itself. And this is because Louis XIV saw himself as a sort of latter-day emperor. You want to connect to the sequence of Roman emperors that preceded him a couple, a millennia or so earlier in history. The Italian palazzo, of course, looks like a simple geometric block with its clearly marked off 3 stories. I've got here a couple other views of the entrance side of the palace. Here, an angular view, which allows us to see the recession of space inward to smaller areas, the marble court then standing innermost. Another view that allows you to see the marble surface of the marble court. This, by the way, is the king's bedroom. Look at the very center of the palace on the 2nd floor. It became the king's bedroom, however, later in time, in the very early 18th century. Originally, his bedroom was located somewhere else, and it seems that locating his bedroom here at the center of the palace was a way of elaborating his identity as Sun King by placing his bedroom, his living quarters, at the very center of the palace, from which the wings of the palace radiate outward. And I show you here a print which illustrates the use of the marble court here as a setting for the performance of opera. A number of times during the reign of Louis XIV, there were great celebrations held which lasted over several days' time. And these were called fêtes. We would translate that as festival. The most important French composer of the time, his name was Lully, wrote operas for the occasion. And we see the performance of an opera going on here. It's called Alceste. It's a tragedy. That's mentioned down below. And it appears that the king is probably sitting here at the very center with the best view of the performance. Other members of the royal family near him. The boxes on either side include the orchestra, the 24 violins and additional instruments. We can see orange trees in planters These could be then moved around, and they need to be brought in uh, indoors during the winter months. They wouldn't survive the cold northern French winter. So the whole thing is very grand, and the royal court lit up for a performance of opera at night. Now, if we go to the other side of the palace, we see something quite different. And this is architecture that's very close to the design of the Palazzo Farnese, that Italian palazzo example that I showed you earlier. There is no visible roof. The facade has the appearance of a simple geometric block, although varied a little bit with projections at the location of 3 different balconies. The stories are marked off clearly from one another, and you'll notice that the classical orders are applied in the form of pilasters and then columns where the balconies are located. It's a little different from the Italian palazzo in that the upper floor is lower in height, and this looks like an attic floor in comparison to the main floor, that is a story above the ground. And then the lower floor looks like a basement. Very simple, very little architectural detail. It appears to be a foundation for the 2 stories above. When the French saw this, it said they were confused. It didn't look like traditional French architecture, of course. It didn't have that visible roof. And they thought maybe it wasn't complete. It was also said that it looked like a building that had burned. The roof had fallen in, leaving only the exterior wall intact. But this shows us the gradual adoption of Italian Baroque architectural design features into the French tradition, as happened gradually over the course of the 17th century. You'll notice that the pilasters divide the second story of the palace into bays. These are regular repeated units. And then, of course, at the balcony, as I said, the order becomes more 3-dimensional in the form of columns. We've got smaller balconies at either end and a large balcony in the center. And it's the Hall of Mirrors that runs from this point, from one balcony all the way down to the end of the other balcony. It's 240 feet long. And then at either end is the room of peace on this side, leading to the queen's quarters, and the room of war at this end, which leads to the king's quarters. We'll take a look at a few of the interior spaces. This is the king's bedroom, located at the center of the palace. You can see that the character of the architecture is really sumptuous. There are pilasters and entablatures that bring a kind of weighty architectural character to the space. The decoration is extremely rich and much use made of gold. Now, this is the room where the king was greeted every morning by courtiers, a few select courtiers who observed his getting out of bed, and this was called the levee, the rising. These words are on your list of terms for review. Levee and coucher. So the levee was the ceremonial rising of the king at the beginning of the day, and the coucher was the ceremonial retiring at the end of the day. So just as the sun comes over the horizon in a glorious way, beautiful to see, the day then in a sort of conventional way begins, work begins with sunrise, and the sun sets in a spectacular fashion at the end of the day. So the king rose and retired in a similar grand way, attended by courtiers. It said that there was a string quartet playing music. The bishop would read his prayers at the end of the day. Somebody else would take the royal bathrobe. Somebody else would blow out the candle, and finally he would be left alone. That happened in this room. We're looking here at the room of war with the Hall of Mirrors seen through the arched doorway leading into the distance. The decoration again is very heavy, very substantial. Painted ceilings, sculpted reliefs on the walls, and architectural elements in the form of entablatures up here. I don't see pilasters in this case. The dominant motif, however, is this oval relief, and I'll show you a detail of that. This was sculpted by the artist Quasseveau, and what's represented here in the Room of War is appropriately Louis trampling the enemies of France. So the king is on horseback. Um, he is turning to look across the landscape in a commanding way. He holds a baton of command. Um, there are defeated enemies at his feet. And then outside the statue itself, of course, he looks very classical in his idealized body type. Above him are figures blowing a trumpet, another holding out a crown of laurel leaves, a crown of victory. So this is again a propagandistic image that extols the glory, the majesty, the power of the king. Here then is the Hall of Mirrors. Called the Hall of Mirrors because on one side of the, well, on one side we have windows that look out across the gardens. And on the other side, in the same arched shape, the same height that go all the way from the floor to the entablature that separates wall from ceiling, are mirrors. So that when you look down this room, there is so much light reflected from the mirrors that you might think that there are windows on either side. Mirrors were very expensive in the 17th century. Venetian glassmakers were brought to Versailles to create these mirrors. And so the mirrors themselves are an embodiment of the wealth, the status of the king. And originally there were solid silver candlesticks, candelabra, I should say, that were about 7 feet tall, standing in front of each of the mirrors. Each one would have a dozen or 2 dozen candles. And when all these were lit up, you can imagine the brilliance of that light reflected from the mirrors into the body of the room. Now, in comparison with Italian Baroque architecture, this is really simple stuff. None of the curves and counter curves of Borromini. Think of the churches of San Ivo della Sapienza or San Carlo alla Quattrofontana. We talked about San Ivo. This is a long rectangular room with simple geometric shape. The ceiling is a semicircular barrel vault. So French architecture tends to be quite conservative in the Baroque period, in contrast to the bold shapes of Italian Baroque architecture. I've got another view that takes away the chandeliers. I'm not sure why they're gone here, perhaps taken out for cleaning. This allows us to see the mirrors a little more clearly, and the pilasters and gilt capitals that mark off the space of the room, modules of space, and we can see the ceiling with its dark, rich decoration. And here is one panel from the decorated ceiling. This is a painting by Charles Lebrun. Now, Lebrun, I said, was the director or supervisor of the entire project here at Versailles, but he was also a painter and a designer of many of the statues. And what this particular panel shows us is the king governs by himself. That is, the king taking the reins of power to having attained his majority, having reached the age of, in this case, I think he was 23, he took over personal rule of the Kingdom of France in place of a regent. And notice above the king, there are the various Olympian gods shown. Mercury with his caduceus and his winged helmet is most conspicuous. So this is just one of a number of scenes which show events in the life of Louis XIV, and particularly military victories won by Louis XIV. Images of authority and power. This is the Royal Chapel, and again, in contrast with French Baroque Italian Baroque architecture, this is very simple. Designed by Jules Hardouin Mansart, it is a long rectangular space with a semicircular end where the altar is located and a semicircular vaulted ceiling. The lower floor, you can see, consists of arches which rest on piers, and then the second floor is articulated by massive Corinthian columns with beautifully carved capitals supporting entablature. Now we're looking at the room from the the position where the king would sit. From here, he has a commanding view of the chapel as a whole. He could access this position directly from his private quarters, and the members of the court would sit down below. Going outside now to take a look at the gardens. Here again is the garden facade. And you'll notice that next to the palace, the gardens, both in their vegetative form and here in these water ponds, it's all kept low to the ground. And this accomplished a number of things. It allowed the palace to be seen prominently, to have a commanding status to the viewer. And if you were in the palace, if you were on the main floor here looking out, then you could see, you had a commanding view across the landscape. Now we're looking in the foreground at what's called a parterre. I'm going to switch ahead here for just a second. Yeah, here, this aerial view allows us to see both water parterres located here and then vegetal parterres. Now, this word parterre, which is on your list of terms, it means literally near the ground. Parterre, terre as in earth, terra, terrain. And this is a word for a type of garden which is either designed low or trimmed low to the ground, allowing one to see over the top of it into the landscape. And typically parterres have a geometric shape. We'll look at some details, but let's go back here to the water parterres. So these lie adjacent to the palace, and at their corners, you can see there are statues, a number of them, and what the statues represent are the major rivers of France. So this is a river god. He personifies one of the rivers of France. I can't tell you which one, but river gods typically are shown in reclining positions. They lean on an urn. Out of the urn, water pours. So this exemplifies the watery content of the river. And he's also holding an oar. And then there is a secondary figure, and sometimes also a cornucopia, because water in the landscape, of course, makes the growth of crops and orchards and the like possible. The water parterre located here would also serve another function, and that is to reflect the light of the sun. So the light that strikes the watery surface would be reflected back up into the hall of mirrors and would increase the luminosity of that room. Let's look now at the planted parterres. Let me come back to that. So here's an example of a parterre made of vegetation. As I said, the parterres are geometric in their shape. In this case, you've got, I think, a square shape overall, which is divided into a number of garden plots. There's a circular fountain in the center. This parterre has topiary, that is shrubs which are clipped into conical or, what would this be called? Kind of a pyramidal form at the corners. And then within the parterre itself, there are plantings. In this case, this must be winter because we don't see any flowers planted here. But I'll show you another view that will include flowers. Boxwood hedges, which are trimmed into ornate curvilinear patterns. These are called broderie because the patterns were adopted from embroidery. Here is an image which would be springtime, and it shows daffodils blooming in profusion in combination with the boxwood hedges. Really beautiful with the topiary down at the corners. And another view that shows you the boxwood patterns. Now let me go back here and show you this. And what we're looking at is the area right out here. This is called the orangery. And let me go forward to that again. There it is. Okay, now what is an orangery? This is an orange garden. And oranges, of course, grow naturally in the Mediterranean. Citrus fruit grows there in abundance, lemons and oranges. But the north of France was too cold for orange trees. So they had to be planted they had to be grown in planters, and you can see that's the case down here. But then you had to have space, and clearly a lot of space, in order to bring all of these trees in their planters indoors during the winter months. So to have an orangery was this was an expression of one's wealth, an expression then of status. And of course, Louis XIV had the biggest orangery of all. You can just see over here a stairway going up to the upper level. And if we could see that wall go around, you would see that there would be French doors, big glass doors within that wall. They could be opened up to bring all the orange trees inside. Here, another view of the orangery. George Washington at Mount Vernon had a small orangery, an enclosed space, kind of a greenhouse-like space, enclosed with a lot of glass that was big enough for maybe a dozen orange trees in all to be brought indoors. Here there were hundreds of orange trees. We're looking at a painting from the 17th century, and this shows Louis XIV at the center of a promenade through the garden. Louis actually wrote a pamphlet describing the path that one should take to view the various parts of the garden in a kind of ideal way, an itinerary. We might call this pamphlet. And he tells you what alleys to take and how to walk from one part of the garden to another to have a thorough and varied and enjoyable experience of the garden. This view allows us to see behind him at a lower level parterres and various fountains, all organized ultimately around this longitudinal axis that goes all the way out across miles of space to the garden. Now, if you move further out into the garden, then one would encounter a number of bosquets, B-O-S-Q-U-E-T. We're seeing one of them here in the foreground. Most of the bosquets are gone. They just simply weren't maintained over the time, and so they've disappeared. I'll show you prints of a couple bosquets, and here we have one that has been restored. So bosquets were located within the forest of the garden, and so they're really hidden from view. And it was only by actually coming to them that one would emerge from the forest into this opening and see the various effects that were created in such a place. This example is the bosquet of the ballroom, and I'm going to show you a print of it as it appeared originally. There is a quatrefoil space that apparently functioned as a ballroom, a place for dancing out of doors. And then what we have here is a fountain. Water erupts from jets at the top of this inclined slope, and then would cascade down across shelves to collecting pools at the bottom. There are places for sitting. We have amphitheater-like seating in a number of places. And the whole thing is contained within a palisade that is a wall which would hide it from view, which make this a hidden kind of discovery as you walk through the garden. Louis would, and his master of ceremonies at the court, would strategically position musicians and groups of musicians in the palisade, so that behind the palisade, so that when you came into the garden, you would seemingly magically hear music. You couldn't see where it was coming from, and it added to the aura that this was a special kind of magical place where effects were experienced that just couldn't be seen anywhere else. I've got one more view of a bosquet. Again, you can see how it's hidden behind a palisade within the forest, and there are architectural features as well as water features. This was the bosquet of the Baths of Apollo. Now, there were a number of major fountains in the grounds at Versailles, and these all have to do with Apollo. So let me explain that Apollo, of course, one of the major Olympian gods, was the god of reason, the god of the arts, and he was the sun god. So Apollo was seen as a kind of divine counterpart to Louis XIV himself. And for Louis to compare himself to Apollo, for people to think of him that way, of course, would elevate his stature. Um, this particular statue is called the Pond of Latona. Latona was the mother of Apollo in Greek myth. And the story here represented has to do with Latona traveling with her children, Apollo and Diana, through the countryside. They're passing through Lycia, and at the end of the day of travel, they are tired and hungry and thirsty, and they Latona appeals to the uh, Lycian peasants for hospitality. They refuse her, and when she tries to take water from a pond to drink, one of them is so impolite as to stir up the mud in the pond, making the water undrinkable. She ultimately complains to Zeus about the way she's been treated, and Zeus responds by turning the Lycian peasants into turtles and frogs. And so that's what you see going on below here. In the uppermost level of this fountain, Latona herself appears with Apollo and Diana uh, uh, at her legs, clustered around her legs, clutching her legs perhaps. And you can see turtles down below and frogs above, and you can see a few human figures who are in the process of turning into turtles and frogs. I've got a few other views. Here's a closer view. And here is the transformation happening. So what? We've got a head of a frog and the body of a female figure below. Now, the fountain is entertaining. It's quite amazing to see this transformation of human beings taking place. But there was a political point to this as well. I guess one of the things I failed to say earlier that prompted Louis's move to Versailles was the fact that during his youth, during his minority, there had been an uprising against the power of the monarchy, which is called the Fronde, Fronde, the Fronde. And the security of the royal family was endangered for a time. Louis didn't forget this. And so the message that's sent here is that if you challenge the power of the king, then you will pay the consequences, just as these Lycian peasants treated Apollo, and the mother of Apollo especially, with badly, inhospitably. They were punished for their actions. So too would the aristocracy of France be punished if they were to rise up and challenge the power of the king. If Louis had conveyed that message in a kind of literal way, then the resulting image might have been offensive, repulsive for the aristocrats to see. So the message is conveyed here in a way that's entertaining, and it's subtle, it's nuanced, and yet if you kind of read below the surface of represented, you get the message, and it comes across in a way that would be a reminder to the aristocracy to keep in line. Don't challenge the power of the king. Elsewhere in the gardens was a statue representing Apollo attended by nymphs at the end of the day. The image of Apollo was based on perhaps the most famous surviving Greek statue of the time. It was in Rome. It was in the collection of the Pope. It was the so-called Apollo Belvedere. And this statue by Girardon represents Apollo in a way that really closely follows the example of an ancient statue. Of course, Apollo is idealized. He's beautifully proportioned in body, and being attended here by beautifully represented nymphs. Well, this is a counterpart then to the coucher, the retiring ceremony of Louis XIV in the palace at the end of the day. So we're reminded again and again and again through the gardens, and really everywhere you go at Versailles, of the identity of Louis XIV. And back in the gardens, we're looking over the top of the Pont de Latona. We see parterres out into the forest where there would be bosquets located. And we're looking down what's called the tapis vert, the green tapestry, toward the Grand Canal. And right in front of the Grand Canal is yet another statue, which we'll look at here. And this represents Apollo at the beginning of the day, rising in his chariot to bring light and life to the world. And so this statue is clearly a counterpart to the levee ceremony that took place in Louis's bedroom at the beginning of the day. It took a lot of water to make all these fountains work. Great expense and effort was put into bringing a lot of water to Versailles. There was never enough. And so today, the fountains are only on Sunday during the summer months, but when that happens, the result is spectacular, as you can see here. This is the basin of Apollo with the fountains on. Apollo rising his chariot out of the water and into the sky. All right, finally, if we look back toward the palace, over the top of the basin of Apollo, we can see the Pont de Latona here in the distance and the palace beyond that. We're looking up the tapis vert, the green tapestry. This was shot in the winter, actually by me many years ago. And you can see that the planters that would contain flowers and statues, these are all covered, so it'd be much grander during the summer months. Originally, all these trees were trimmed off in a straight line so that the gardens are even more geometric, more strictly ordered. But you notice as we see the palace that there's a flight of stairs that leads up to the palace, and it leads not to the first floor, which is hidden from view, but to the second floor. The stairway seems to be connected to the palace. The stairway doesn't cut across the middle of the floor, which might be unsightly, but it leads right to the second floor. The point here is that these effects of palace and gardens are connected across great amounts of space. The ground level has to be just right here at the basin of Apollo, which is a focal point for us to look back and see these different things come together coherently across space to form such perfect pictures. And this shows the extent to which vast amounts of ground were raised and lowered, and objects of architecture and sculpture coordinated to harmonize with one another across space toward the aim of expressing the power, the authority, the grandeur of Louis XIV. Let me read you just a paragraph about this, which kind of summarizes a lot of what I've said. The ingenious emblematic conceits devised for the glorification of Louis XIV at Versailles formed one of the most complicated and far-reaching iconographical programs of the 17th century. It must first be pointed out, wrote André Philibien in 1674, that since the sun is the emblem of the king, and since the poets confound the sun and Apollo, there is nothing in this superb residence that is not related to this divinity, that is Apollo, but one might also say to the king. The image of the sun in splendor governed the design of the entire complex, in which the great avenues and alleys appear to radiate from the palace, the dwelling place of the Sun King. In the apartment of the king, a suite of 7 rooms corresponding to the 7 planets culminated in the Salon d'Apollon, the room of Apollo, which also served appropriately as the throne room. The ceilings of these rooms, painted under the direction of Charles Brun, represented the deeds of the heroes of antiquity in relation to each of the planets and to the deeds of His Majesty. The theme of the Salle de Venus is the submission of gods and heroes to the power of the goddess of love. One of the pictures in the coving of the vault represents the wedding of Alexander and Roxana, which is to be understood as an allusion to the marriage of Louis XIV and Maria Theresa. The laborious ritual that accompanied the daily lever and coucher of the monarch in the royal bedchamber constituted yet another allusion to Louis XIV as the light of the world. So all these identities merge together. Um, Alexander the Great, Apollo, the sun god, um, and the sun king to enhance the grandeur, the status, the magnificence of the sun king, Louis